good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to all of our delegates at today's GEM workshop. I hope you're having a productive session. This is our first online GEM. So I do hope that all your meetings have been successful. David and I are going to take this opportunity at the lunchtime session to have a think about some insights and tourism stats, particularly around the value of tourism and how we might go about recovering that. I think during a pandemic such as this, it's easy to forget just how valuable our industry is, both to economies and to society. So the World Travel and Tourism Council had it at 37 million jobs in European tourism in 2019, contributing nearly $2 billion to GDP. So it's really important to remember that during these times. And as I said, I'm very pleased to have with me David Edwards, who is our resident tourism stats expert. So welcome, David. I'm pleased to be speaking with you again. We are going to be discussing stats and insights that are all available on the ETOA Insight Hub. So I will just share my screen now and I will show you what we will be covering today. So as I said, we're going to be thinking about recovering the value of tourism into 2021 and beyond. And so we'll be covering an overview of the Insight Hub. I will show you that because it's quite a new member service and some people may not have had a chance to have a look at the stats and reports that are there. David will take us through some of the latest indications around passenger numbers and visitor intentions to travel. And we will have a discussion about that in terms of what that really means for future prospects. And then we have selected 3 pieces that are also on the Insight Hub that we think are relevant to this topic. And we're going to have a look at some of the key pieces of information in there and discuss those. So I will give a very quick whistle-stop tour of the Insight Hub so that you can see what's there if you haven't had a chance to see, as I say. So you can find the Insight Hub just from the home page of our website. Just here, if you click Insight Hub, it will bring you to the pages. And here you can find the latest pieces that we've added. But those are just the most recent ones. And if you actually want to look for a specific category, accommodation or aviation, for example, you can just click on that and it will show you the pieces that are relevant to that category. And what we have done with all the pieces on here is we do appreciate that lots of people don't have time necessarily to go through very thick reports. So fortunately for us, David has done a lot of the hard work for us and has written some summaries. Say, for example, if I wanted to look at this piece from UNWTO, if I just click the more, you can here access the summary. So David has written a brief summary with the key things. And if you want to delve further and have the entire report, you can just click on it there. So that is really it. We update it monthly, so we're putting several pieces up a month. You'll see most of it has this yellow members sign across it. That means it's available for members only. It is primarily a service for our members. So if you don't have an ETOA website login, do please let us know, but you do need one in order to access all the member content on the website. So I think that is really as much as we need to see from the Insight Hub. So do have a visit if you haven't had the chance just yet. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to David so that he can take us through some of the latest stats on this topic. So I'll hand over to you, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. And just to reiterate what you said a moment or two ago, I do hope the delegates are having a fantastic GEM so far. Hopefully you can now see my screen. And the first slide we're going to take a look at is based on data from Airports Council International and Eurocontrol. And this colourful chart is showing us what's been happening to the volume of passengers passing through European airports over the past 6 or so months. So the blue bars are just how many people there were. So we can see that period of really tight lockdown in the spring and early summer where there was virtually nobody traveling by air. Then we can see a gradual recovery through to August, and then starting to drift down a little bit. Now, the red line on the chart, which we gauge from the right-hand upright axis, is telling us what does this volume of passengers represent compared with the equivalent day of 2019. So we can see that back in July, August, the volume of passengers was still about 65% or so down on where we were a year ago. And this chart takes us through to the very end of September, by which time, whilst there was variation by day of week, we can see that typically the volume of passengers was 70 to 75% lower than it was a year ago. And the very latest figures just on the number of flights rather than the number of passengers indicates a further tailing off as we've moved into October. So, for example, just this week, we're seeing Ryanair operate around about a quarter fewer flights than they were operating 7 days ago, and IAG announcing, so that's BA, Iberia, Aer Lingus, etc., are now going to be operating just 30% of their winter schedule, whereas up until recently they had been planning on operating 40% of their schedule. So quite clear evidence here that whilst there was some recovery in demand during the summer, that recovery has not continued.
Thank you, David. I think that's really interesting when we're looking at the volume of passengers at European airports like we are on this slide. I'm wondering, is there any further information as to the drivers of that? Because obviously there's been a lot of discussion about very near neighbours and domestic tourism. Is it all of that, or do we have any indication about long-haul travellers?
Most of the evidence that exists at present tends to suggest that intercontinental travel to and from Europe is still no more than a trickle. So the vast majority of the passengers who are travelling through Europe's airports at the moment are travelling to somewhere else in Europe. I think what we saw back in the height of summer was a degree of what we might term longer short-haul travel. So there was quite a bit of travel from Germany to the Canary Islands, from perhaps Scandinavia and the UK going down to some of the Greek islands. But the overwhelming bulk of travel as we've moved from high summer into autumn is relatively local. So even if not domestic, it is, say, Germany to Italy. We're not seeing a great deal of longer travel going on at the present time.
Indeed, thank you.
So if we move forward and start to look at what's been happening to consumer confidence, and this is a screenshot from OECD data, which is a really useful source of lots of background data on economics and demographics. This is showing us what's been happening to consumer confidence in 9 long-haul markets for Europe. And this is over quite a substantial period, but if we just cursorize to the right-hand side of each of the charts, we can see a reasonably common pattern going on, whereby consumer confidence really declined very steeply in the spring of this year and then started to rebound. Now, the rebound, and a lot of these time series end in August or September, a lot of the rebound up until that point had not taken us back to where we were pre-March of this year. And whilst it's too early to say with any certainty, I think we may well see some of these confidence levels starting to deteriorate again, as particularly in Europe and in some other parts of the world, there has been a faster resurgence of the virus than was perhaps being anticipated.
Thank you, David. I mean, one thing that occurred to me as you were speaking there is, what do we think is the role of the insurance industry in this? Because, you know, we've seen lots of focus groups, for example, where people have said, alongside catching coronavirus, my other main worry is losing my money if I have to cancel. So what's putting me off booking is the fact that I may never see that money again if the trip is not able to go ahead. And do you think that with the sort of resurgence of more comprehensive insurance products, do you think that might have a positive effect on consumer confidence?
I think undoubtedly a broader range of relevant insurance products will have a positive effect, but to use a phrase we hear quite a lot currently, on its own, it's not going to be a silver bullet for re-establishing consumer confidence. For that to happen, we need perhaps both lower levels of transmission of the virus itself, but also people feeling confident about their overall personal economic circumstances, and also feeling less unsure about, well, what's going to happen in terms of quarantine measures, travel advisories, because yes, it's great if you've got an insurance policy in place and you can think, at least I know that pot of money is secure. There is still a disincentive to some extent to book a trip if you have in the back of your mind, well, I don't really want to have to go through all of the hassle of having to change the dates should things not transpire in the way that we all hope they're going to.
Yes, yes, indeed. And actually, this reminds me of another piece that you have written for us, David, for the Insight Hub, which is your analysis based on your 3Ms theory of the drivers of travel in terms of people needing the means, the motivation, and the money. And obviously the means is generally controlled by governments, and the motivation is around intent to travel, as we're going to discuss further, and also the money so to do. As I say, that's another very interesting piece on our Insight Hub if you want to have a look. And I see here you've got a slide around employment and job security.
Indeed. So it is all about the motivation, the money, and the means of getting to and from a place, as you've just highlighted. And increasingly, people's concerns are turning to, well, is my job secure? What will happen when a furlough regime either ends or becomes less generous? So the chart I'm showing here, again drawing on OECD data, looks at half a dozen or so long-haul source markets for Europe and plots the rate of unemployment over the past 15 or so years. And we can see, particularly in the Americas, a very, very sharp spike in unemployment in the spring of this year. Things then started to improve as we moved into summer, but even with that improvement, the level of unemployment was still substantially higher than it had been pre-pandemic. Now, many people at the very early stages of the pandemic were saying, oh, we think there's going to be a V-shaped recession whereby things will get very bad very quickly, but they would then recover very quickly. I think what most people are now accepting we're going to see is that whilst there has been a degree of improvement, we have certainly not returned to the volumes of activity that were happening pre-pandemic.
Yes, absolutely. I like that you have brought up a crystal ball there, David, because I think a lot of this, certainly in terms of solid data into 2021, still does feel a little bit like kind of looking into a crystal ball. I mean, and thinking into 2021, is there any reliable data around these sorts of things? Or do you think at the moment it's too difficult to call?
It is always difficult to predict what precisely is going to happen to tourism flows, because even in quote unquote normal times, they are subject to tastes, they're subject to what's happening to economics, they're subject to what's happening in terms of new air routes and the marketing that different destinations are doing. But at the moment, uncertainty is absolutely on steroids. And whilst there are one or two pieces of evidence that, oh yes, people are booking travel in 2021, I think we have to be exceedingly cautious, because if we were to wind the clock back 6 months or so, there were many who were saying, oh yes, travel's going to be recovering really quickly come summer, autumn of 2021, and unfortunately that hasn't really materialized. So whilst I think what we can be sure of is that the bulk of people will still want to take holidays, they're not going to have fallen out of love with the idea of having a holiday. There is so much going on in both people's individual economic circumstance and in terms of how easy or difficult it is to travel internationally, that 2021 looks decidedly challenging.
Yes, and actually this brings to mind another piece of research that's on the Insight Hub, which is from our partners over in the United States, the United States Tour Operators Association. They recently carried out a survey of their tour operator members around what's actually been booked. And the majority, it does seem, is for Q3 of 2021 at the moment. So I think that certainly chimes very much with what you're saying, David. That piece, by the way, is also on the Insight Hub if you want to have a look at it from USTOA. I think this now, David, is probably a good point to move into some of the pieces that are on the Insight Hub that we think are relevant to this topic in terms of communicating the value of tourism to the economy and society. And the first one we've got is a policy brief from UNWTO. So thinking about a public sector view first, which is around the opportunities that this pandemic presents for transforming tourism. David, perhaps you wouldn't mind taking us through the key highlights of this piece?
Absolutely. So this is quite a substantial report, so you have to devote a bit of time if you want to read it from front to end. What the report does is a number of things, one of which is that it very, very helpfully reinforces the vital importance that tourism plays, not just to economies around the world, but also to societies and communities. And there are a number of nuggets, one or two I'll touch on in the next slide. But the report spends quite a lot of time discussing how recovery from COVID-19 is actually an opportunity for tourism. And it breaks this opportunity down into a number of different pillars, including for tourism to better reflect local values, to create what are termed decent jobs, to reduce the carbon footprint that the sector generates, and also to protect the wider environment. Now, one or two of the nuggets that it talks about in the report that are helpful in reinforcing just how vital tourism is around the world is that tourism has become the world's third largest export sector, now accounting for roughly 7% of trade. And there is an estimate made in this report that the scale of job losses that may have been brought about by the reduction in travel demand in 2020 rather, could well be in the region of 100 million jobs worldwide. Now, here's a couple of screenshots from the report that I thought it was worth sharing. On the left-hand panel, we have got what the UNWTO report terms this roadmap for a sustainable recovery in tourism. And each of the different elements there are entirely worthy. So you would really struggle to say, I disagree with any of those. I guess one of the things we might discuss is, well, is this realistic? Over on the right-hand panel, the report also highlights a number of very helpful examples of how different governments in different parts of the world have been taking real-time action in 2020 to try and support both jobs in the travel and tourism sector and also support enterprises within the wider tourism economy.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very encouraging to see such a long list of governments that are doing things to support the industry. So on the one hand, that is encouraging, but something that you alluded to a moment ago, David, as I'm reading this, and obviously we're a good 6-8 months into the pandemic, and it sort of mentions that deconstructing our industry for 18 months really presents this opportunity to kind of rebuild better. Do you think, though, at this point, when people are focusing on survival. Do you think it's realistic, or is it all a bit blue sky thinking when really people need to focus on survival? Can we do the two together, I suppose, is my thought.
It absolutely is, to an extent, blue sky thinking, but to some degree, if now is not an opportunity to think about alternative ways of doing things, potentially there's never going to be a better opportunity, because things have been completely thrown up into the air so much. But your point is an entirely valid one, that so many businesses, whether they're a really small to medium-sized enterprise, so an individual independent hotel or activity provider, through to some of the larger hotel groups and airlines and operators, they're all thinking, crikey, am I actually going to be able to get through this? And therefore their priority is ensuring that their business is here in 2021 and 2022 and able to operate. So in one sense, yes, this is the perfect opportunity to take that step back and think, oh, can I do things differently? So maybe what we might actually see is this being an opportunity for innovators and what some often term disruptors, so perhaps new players to the industry who aren't laden down with the baggage of an existing business model and a way of working, saying, oh, I've spotted the fact that people post-pandemic will absolutely still want to travel. They might want to travel in different ways, and almost creating a business from scratch to accommodate those new ways of taking holidays in the future.
Yes, absolutely. I think some of it may very well be driven by consumer demand as well, if some people change their preferences, which we have seen on certain insights that have come up. Obviously, people wanting more outdoors things or perhaps more remote locations. So yes, indeed, it may be that consumer demand actually drives some of this, as well as just the industry and legislation. I think we can take this opportunity to move on now to think about more private sector thinking, which is from the World Travel and Tourism Council. And one of the pieces we've picked out is their recovery scenarios, whereby they have produced various scenarios based on how the pandemic plays out. And David is just going to take us through some of those. And we can discuss the key points from the private sector point of view.
Thank you, Rachel. So indeed, this was a very interesting piece of analysis undertaken by WTTC and their partners, Oxford Economics. And for those who want to read the report, it's very readable and it's just 5 pages long. But what WTTC have also done is take the opportunity of producing some accompanying infographics. And there is one for each world region and also an overall global view, if you do want to see everything that the report is talking about on just a single sheet of paper. And the modelling covers or produced a baseline scenario and then what was called an upside and a downside scenario. What the analysis also does is make a real plea for what is termed swift and coordinated action by governments. And now clearly one can have an interesting discussion as to whether or not that is what we have seen in recent months and may or may not see in the upcoming period. Now, this modelling took place in June of this year, which may only be 3 or 4 months ago, but in all honesty, looking at the data that we have covered in these slides and is knocking around elsewhere, it is probably fair to say that what was termed the downside scenario at that stage is probably the scenario that now looks most likely to represent the reality for 2020. And within this downside scenario, the estimation was that at a global level, 198 million jobs could be lost. Bear in mind, we mentioned a few moments ago the UNWTO estimate of 100 million. So here, the WTTC estimate, perhaps a slightly broader definition of travel and tourism, and also taking their downside scenario, but close to 200 million jobs being lost in the sector. That primarily being driven by this 70% reduction in the overall flow of tourism. Now, the study suggests a number of what are termed building blocks that are necessary if we are going to see recovery from COVID-19, and there are many and varied. They include a reduction in the infection rate. Now, clearly the virus itself is just as transmissible now as it was at the start of the year, so this reduction in the infection rate will only come about due to changes in human behavior, how we interact with one another, and or the development in the longer term of a vaccine. One of the other building blocks is what is termed extensive and consistent approach to testing and tracing, which would thereby enable freer flow of international travel, the introduction of travel corridors, and the removal of travel advisories by governments around the world, and crucially, government support for the travel and tourism sector to continue. What I've shown on this slide is the infographic for Europe, and we can think of this as being 3 panels, if you like. The leftmost panel shows us the scale of travel and tourism in Europe in 2019. So that 37 million jobs and 2018 billion. So I'm not sure whether there is a quite a correct term for 2000 billion, but trust me, it's a lot. And that was representing growth on the previous year. Then in the middle panel, we've got some of the key metrics from the downside, the upside, and the baseline scenario that was put together back in June of this year. And then over on the rightmost panel, we can see the necessary actions that WTTC reckoned would have to be taken were the downside scenario to be averted.
Indeed, and as you mentioned, David, this being done in June, it does look more likely that their downside as of June would be the most likely one for 2020. One thing that strikes me, though, when we look at this slide is, to me, it presents a very strong case for greater support for our industry in terms of the government support, as you mentioned on one of your previous slides. Do you think so too, David, in terms of, say, how this compares with other industries? I would like to go to many governments waving this card saying, here's the case. What's your opinion on that?
Absolutely. I think many have said that travel and tourism was the sector that was hit first. It's the sector that has been hit hardest, and it is the sector that is likely to see the slowest recovery, both because of all of the restrictions that have been in place in terms of people's confidence about travelling, and just the wider economic harm that we have seen over the past number of years. So, for example, back in 2008-9, it is reckoned that certainly business travel, for example, took about 3 to 4 years to recover from the impacts of the global financial crisis. And frankly, the impact from the pandemic has been at least as severe as was seen 10, 11, 12 years ago. And that in its own right means that we're talking about 3 or 4 years before levels start to get back to where they were. And I think the other strong case that can be made for why travel and tourism is so dependent, and why government support will be so very helpful, is that it genuinely is an economic sector that delivers opportunities for people of all skills levels and of all ages to work and to develop life skills. So younger people getting their first job. And it also covers a vast array of different skills, whether that is some of the more stereotypical roles within hospitality, but right through to digital roles, marketing roles, engineering roles within the travel sector. And so just the breadth of types of job that tourism can support and the geographical spread that it has So not just supporting jobs in larger conurbations, but in much more sparsely populated parts of Europe and other continents, where there is no real alternative economic driver of activity to keep local businesses thriving and allowing people to enjoy different cultures and different culinary tastes. And so absolutely, this is the sort of data that needs to be being hammered home to governments around the world to say, look, this is what tourism can do for economies and for societies, but it is in dire need of sufficient support, that it's there and ready to reactivate as soon as people are able to start traveling once again.
Yes, absolutely. I think we should bring you along to some of our meetings with the European Commission, David. Hopefully we get them to open the purse strings. But absolutely, I think that that's a really important point about the value of our industry to society in terms of offering jobs for people who don't necessarily have anything else that they could do because they've lost it in another sector as well. I think that's a really important point you make there. And we're going to move on to our final piece that we want to showcase today, which is the Global Web Index about the state of travel in 2020 in terms of people's intent to travel, which I think is something that we really need to touch upon, because obviously we've talked about the general climate, but what about the actual demand coming from the people who are out there looking to buy tickets? David, what's in this one?
Thank you. So again, starting with some of the key points. Now, this study is the first one that we've touched on in this session, which really tries to listen to actual consumers. So we've seen the public sector view, we've seen the private sector view, now we're seeing the people who really matter, what's their view, so potential travellers. And so this study reports the findings from an online survey, which was undertaken in April and May of this year across 17 different nations. And it was an online survey, but increasingly, even in more far-flung parts of the world, the majority of people do have online access. So we can certainly say it is broadly representative. And the good news here is that it revealed a really strong intent to travel in the future. So coming back to that point that people have not all of a sudden fallen out of love with the idea of taking a holiday. However, what the study also found was that there was certainly a greater focus being placed on health and personal safety issues by those respondents across the 17 markets than perhaps existed pre-pandemic. There was a clear shift towards people thinking about domestic destinations or places that were somewhat closer to home than perhaps they had previously been imagining they would be travelling to. And what I think is perhaps really interesting, given that this study was taking place back in April and May, so quite a while ago now, even at that relatively early stage within the pandemic, the report highlights that there were concerns emerging about personal finances. So people started to think, really, am I going to be able to afford travel? So not necessarily a health-related disinclination to travel, more of a wealth-related disinclination to travel, or at least concerns about wealth. Another fairly substantial part of the report, which is full of not just commentary, but also lots of interesting charts and diagrams, but another fairly substantial part of the report talks about this thing called touchless travel. So the digitalization of travel, whether that's when we're moving through airports, train stations, ferry ports, whether it's when we're on a tour, in hotels, increasingly in restaurants and bars. So becoming ever more used to relying upon our phone for making transactions. But what the report very ably demonstrates is that there is a risk that this move towards touchless travel does risk disenfranchising certain individuals in society who may not have access to that technology, either through issues of income, through issues of disability, or even just choice of not having certain levels of technology. What I've done on this screen is just taken a screenshot from one part of one of the diagrams within the report that we're talking about here, looking at travel behaviours post-outbreak. And it breaks down attitudes towards some of the statements that were posed by age. And we can see that, at least for those that I've highlighted here, there wasn't really substantial variation across the different age categories. But we can certainly see that there was a stated intent back in April and May for people to be saying, well, do you know what, I think I'm going to be taking more local trips, going on more staycations than perhaps I previously imagined I would have been doing. And we can see in the second chart along there was only a minority saying they were going to take fewer trips, but interestingly, some of the younger age groups perhaps being the more likely to say, oh, in the short term, I'm probably going to be taking fewer trips. And perhaps that again plays into this issue of people, particularly in younger age groups, being very concerned as to whether or not they are going to have the levels of income that they were perhaps hoping that they would have.
Yes, thanks for that, David. I actually think this piece is a slightly more positive note to end on, because the thing that I take from it is that the fact that there is still this strong desire to travel. As you say, people still want to see the world and experience other cultures. The pandemic hasn't taken that away. And to me, it is an indication of a temporary situation as opposed to a permanent shift. Say, for example, we've seen in certain other areas of our lives, things that may never change back. For example, working from home. Many people have said, this works well, I'm not going to be going every day, or I'm not going nearly as often. And indeed, many businesses have said, we won't be needing our premises. So say, for example, if I'm a commercial landlord, I'm in a very different situation than a tour operator or an attraction or anyone else involved in tourism, in that I am currently in an awful situation, but there may well be a way out of it, as in this is not a permanent shift in the way that we behave. Do you think that's a fair thing to say about this piece?
Absolutely. I think it does demonstrate that people haven't suddenly decided that after generations and generations of people wanting to go on holiday and increasingly being able to go on holiday, that all of a sudden they will become hermits and never leave their own home. I think there will be let's assume, and this is obviously just an assumption, but let's assume that within the next 2 or 3 years at least, the pandemic has become history because a successful vaccine has both been developed and administered to the bulk of populations worldwide. So I do think we're talking about years rather than months before we can say, yep, we're back to as we were. There may well be a slither of society who have been so impacted by this that they are perhaps more apprehensive about mingling and traveling. Perhaps we will also, though, see the topic that everybody was talking about until the spring of 2020, climate change, re-emerging, and perhaps that being the topic that has a longer term and more substantial impact on the ways in which we travel and the amount of travel that we do. But all of the research I've ever been involved in, which is looking at why do people go on holiday, it's to fulfill really important emotional needs about having the opportunity to relax, having the opportunity to spend quality time with their friends, their family, their loved ones, to experience new cultures, to meet new people, and just to have a degree of serendipity in their life. And I don't think the pandemic has quashed that. It's just at the moment, both people are so concerned about their own economic well-being. Many are also concerned about their health. Equally, layered on top of that, we have got all of the barriers that are in place in terms of trying to dissuade people from mingling with others and whilst all of that is still in situ, it's going to be quite a long road to recovery, but that innate human will to want to go places, to explore and experience new things, I think this report very ably demonstrates that that still exists.
Yes, and actually I think the point about when we were thinking about the WTTC piece in terms of presenting a strong economic and societal reason to support the industry in terms of government support, I think this adds another strand to that in terms of the resilience of our industry. It is one that bounces back. It just needs temporary help, and then it'll be back on its own 2 feet. And I think the fact that there's always this motivation to travel, which is one of the 3 M's of your theories, really helps with the resilience of our industry and presents an even stronger case in terms of support. So that is all of the pieces that we wanted to cover in this session. I know you will be shortly back to your appointments at the GEM workshop. So just to finish with a reminder that everything we've discussed today and referenced is available on the Insight Hub. So do go and have a look and download some of those reports if you want to. You can always contact us on insight@etoa.org if you have any questions. David and I are happy to answer those personally on an individual level. And equally, if there are any other categories you think we should cover on the Insight Hub, do please let us know and we can have a look at adding pieces relating to that. So it just remains for me to wish all of the GEM delegates a very productive and successful afternoon at the workshop, and to thank David Edwards for his contribution once again to another interesting piece on ETOA Insight. So thank you, David, and good afternoon, delegates.